This week's lecture is going to focus on phylogeny, our understanding of evolutionary history. So this is sort of like building those family trees of life that you see all over your biology book. We're going to use evolutionary history to classify organisms, which is different than the way we used to do it. We used to classify organisms by how they looked, but now we want to use something a little deeper, a little more biological. Not just how they look, but how they evolved and who they came from. So, for example, you're out in the woods and you find this critter right here. And what would you call that? I think a lot of us would say, whoa, look at that snake, right? It looks like a snake. It looks a lot like a snake. It's a legless reptilian. Yeah, that's a snake, right? And that's how it was classified originally. But with further study, we may change our minds. So let's define one of the major terms, the term that is the chapter title here, phylogeny. Phylogeny is the evolutionary history of an organism. Phylogenetics is the study of the evolutionary history of organisms, okay? And we use our knowledge of evolution to build these trees of life, these trees that depict hypotheses of how we think organisms are related. So I want to point this out right now, that these trees that we make, are hypotheses. And they can change with new evidence. If we find a new fossil or we find some new genes or genetic information, these trees will change. Now, another term I want to point out is the term systematics. Systematics is the science of classifying organisms and determining their relationships. So these are all kind of related. So systematics is the science of classifying organisms and determining how they're related. So one of the ways to do systematics is by building phylogenies, okay? So you can study the evolutionary history of organisms and classify them based on their evolutionary history. And lastly, taxonomy is another word, which is the science involved in naming organisms. And so taxonomy is a branch of systematics. Okay? So our goal now is to use phylogeny to do systematics and to do taxonomy. To name things based on how they're related rather than just how they look. Like our legless reptile before, is that a snake? Well, of course we would have called it a snake if we had no concept of evolution. But we know about evolution now. And that makes us look deeper and look more closely at the traits these organisms share. And what we can see in this organism is, if we study it closely, is that it has a lot of traits that are more like a lizard than a snake. Of course, it doesn't have limbs. But what we know is that evolution can add traits to an organism, or it can remove traits from an organism. And so snakes, their ancestors had legs and they've lost limbs. And these lizards, called glass lizards, have also lost their limbs. And we could classify them right here and assume maybe they're related to snakes, but what we believe, based on their other features, is that they're actually lizards that have lost their legs. So, for example, they have eyelids, unlike snakes. They can blink. They don't have jaws that can unhinge, like snakes can. They have lots of features that are more like lizards than snakes. They just have one snake-like feature, and that's a loss of legs. So we would have to move them from the way they used to be classified. We used to think they were snakes. Now we say, well, evolutionarily speaking, they're not snakes. They're actually legless lizards. Now, this idea of naming things and organizing them is pretty ancient. It all started, of course, with taxonomy, just trying to name things. Way back in the day, Theophrastus, who was a student of Aristotle and Plato, they started naming things. A lot of people that named things back in the ancient era were herbalists, meaning they were like doctors who named plants so they could be used for medicine, and you could describe which plant cured which kind of disease. but their names were polynomials. Poly is the word for, it means many, and nomial means name. So this is many names. For example, this plant down at the bottom of the screen, its name back in the Middle Ages was Mentha floribus spiccatus folius oblonga serratus. That means mentha, which is mint, like menthol, flowers in a spike, foliage is oblong and serrated. The common name for this plant nowadays is spearmint, okay? But they use these long names. They were Latin descriptions of what the plant looked like. That's what the name was. But that's hard to memorize, hard to pass from one scientist to another. Then along came Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, and he writes a book on the species of plants in the mid-1700s. And what he does is he takes those long names and he abbreviates them. So he also grouped things together into a hierarchy. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. He created that classification, and he put similar critters into similar groups based on how they looked. So he placed closely related, and I say related here, he got a lot of it right. He got a lot of it wrong too, because he based it only on how organisms look. He didn't know about evolution, and he did not know about convergence, right? And he put closely related organisms into the same genus, for example. In similar genre, he would put into the same family, so on and so forth. And he used binomial nomenclature. So instead of Mentha spiccatus folius oblonga serratus, he just shortened it to Mentha spiccata. 2 words, 2 names, binomial, 2 names, Mentha spiccata. And sometimes you'll see a letter at the end of that. That just means named by Linnaeus, right? If you name a new species, your name goes after that as well. But you won't get to use just a letter because you're not as famous as Linnaeus. For example, I named a fossil fern, and I published it with my graduate supervisor, Dr. Stocky. So our names are there: Phylogenetics, McCurty, Carafit, and Stocky. Now you won't see those people's names at the end of it every time it's used, but in a scientific paper, usually the first time a scientific name is used, you'll see the authority, the people who named it listed as well. And let's look at the way we write these, because I want you to write it properly every time this semester. When you write a Latin name, a scientific name, you capitalize the first part. This is the name of the genus, Phylogenetics. The second part of the name is called the specific epithet, and it's lowercase, okay? Now, there can be more than one specific epithet in a genus. So for example, Homo sapiens is humans, and Homo erectus is, well, Homo erectus, right? So there can be more than one species within a genus. But the species name is this whole thing, Phylogenetics McCurty. Homo sapiens is our species, okay? And by the way, when you type these, you always italicize them. If you're writing them by hand, you underline them, okay? So Linnaeus put these organisms into groups. He named them, he gave them these specific 2-word names, and then he categorized them. For example, Canis lupus is the species of dog. Actually, there's a subspecies too, which we don't get into much in this class, but Canis lupus familiaris is the common dog. Canis lupus includes wolves, the species. Genus Canis, family Canidae, that's the dog family. Order Carnivora, that includes cats and dogs. Class Mammalia, we're in that group, right? Phylum Chordata, that's everything with a backbone. Kingdom Animalia, that's all the animals. And then this one was added later, domain Eukarya, anything with a nucleus. So each one of these groups in the Linnaean classification system, any one of these levels is called a taxon. T-A-X-O-N, a taxon. And they're all nested within one another. For example, domain Eukarya contains all the eukaryote kingdoms. The kingdom Animalia contains lots of different phyla, including phylum Chordata, so on and so forth, until we get more and more narrow all the way down to the species or subspecies level, Canis lupus familiaris, or in our case, Homo sapiens, right? Okay, so we can see that here, the Linnaean classification system laid out, and this is where we'll pick up in the next video.